It all started on a regular school day, the kind that seemed ordinary to anyone walking through the hallways. The fluorescent lights hummed above, lockers rattled as students moved between classes, and the familiar chatter filled every corner. But in the midst of this ordinary chaos, a small group of classmates were already plotting something that they thought would be the highlight of their week. They were excited, practically buzzing with anticipation, convinced that what they were about to do would be hilarious. They leaned against lockers, whispering to each other, sneaking glances around to make sure no one else could hear, while their eyes kept darting toward the person they had targeted. The plan wasn't complicated. It didn't require much effort or preparation. All it required was the presence of one person, the man they intended to mock. They had noticed him weeks before, noticing the subtle ways he moved through the classroom, the quiet confidence that seemed almost invisible at first glance. He didn't draw attention to himself. He didn't boast or brag. He wasn't flashy or loud like so many of the other students' parents who occasionally came to school events. He simply existed, calmly and deliberately, and for that reason, he had become the focus of this small group's misguided humor. The students had labeled him as different in their own minds, which, for them, was enough justification to make him the butt of their joke. They thought that by pointing out what they perceived as oddities, his quiet demeanor, his choice of clothing, the way he carried himself, they could get a laugh, get some approval from the others, and prove to themselves that they were clever, witty, and socially superior. They started talking openly about it during lunch break, pretending to casually bring it up as if it were an afterthought, when in reality they were meticulously planning every detail. One of them joked about what he might say, another imagined how he might react, and yet another calculated how many people they could get to watch the scene unfold. They treated the situation as if it were a simple game, a harmless prank, something that had no real-world consequences. The irony was that none of them stopped to consider the human being at the center of their plan. They didn't think about feelings, about dignity, or about the fact that this person had a life beyond the classroom, a life full of experiences, struggles, and triumphs that they couldn't even begin to understand. The target of their plan, unaware of the plotting, went about his usual day. He carried himself with a quiet ease, moving through the halls with the same calm presence that had caught their attention in the first place. He greeted a few students politely, smiled at the younger kids passing by, and focused on his own tasks. There was no hint that he had any awareness of the storm that was brewing around him. The classmates assumed he was naive, that he would react exactly as they imagined, flustered, embarrassed, maybe even a little scared. Their minds were filled with scenes of laughter and applause, completely blind to the possibility that reality might not play out according to their script. As the day went on, the group began to coordinate their approach. Some suggested starting with subtle remarks, little jabs here and there, to test the waters before escalating into something more overt. Others argued for being direct, thinking that a bold move would make the prank even funnier. They debated timing, location, and the number of witnesses. Each suggestion seemed more ridiculous than the last, but none of them stopped to question the morality of what they were planning. In their minds, it was all in good fun. They ignored the quiet undercurrent of tension that had started to build as they imagined themselves the stars of the show, convinced that the center of attention would inevitably be humiliated in a way that would validate their social standing. Some of them even practiced lines, whispered phrases into each other's ears, and laughed at the thought of how perfect it would be. They imagined the reactions of bystanders, the murmurs of approval, the stifled giggles, and the sense of triumph that would wash over them when the scene unfolded exactly as they envisioned. Every detail was scrutinized, every scenario played out in their minds, until the plan seemed flawless. They felt a mix of excitement and anticipation, as if they were preparing for a performance on a stage, except this stage was a classroom, and the unsuspecting man they were targeting was the unwitting lead actor. Even the smallest details became part of their plotting. They talked about timing, how to position themselves, what gestures or expressions to use, and how to make sure that others would notice without letting the teacher intervene. The more they discussed, the more they reinforced each other's sense of cleverness. Their confidence grew with every whispered joke, every imagined scene, until it became a shared obsession, a singular focus that consumed their attention during every free moment. They never stopped to consider that this wasn't a story to be told in whispers or a scene to be staged for amusement. They didn't consider that the person they were targeting was not a prop, not a character in their fantasy, but a human being with feelings, pride, and a life beyond their understanding. They were so caught up in their excitement, their arrogance, and their need to impress each other that they failed to recognize the gravity of what they were about to do. He had always been quietly noticeable, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but earned it in subtle ways. His son was one of the classmates, but he himself had become a quiet fixture around the school whenever he came to pick him up or drop him off. Most people only saw what they wanted to see. A man going about his business, wearing simple clothes, keeping to himself, carrying a briefcase or a gym bag without any flair. There was nothing flashy about him, no designer labels, no loud announcements of his accomplishments, no bragging, no public display that would invite attention. To some, that made him invisible. To others, it was a challenge, an opportunity to fill in the gaps with assumptions. The students who were plotting their little prank had barely noticed him at first, except that he was different. There was a hesitancy in the way he moved, a calm assurance that didn't match the loud confidence of most parents they encountered. He never tried to compete or dominate a conversation. He never tried to show off what he had or who he knew. That quietness, combined with the fact that he was a single father, made him an easy target in their minds. They had learned very little about him. Yet in their imagination, they constructed a persona that suited the narrative they wanted. A man who was awkward, out of place, someone whose very presence could be laughed at if handled correctly. It wasn't just the students' ignorance. It was their assumptions layered over each other. They assumed he lived a modest life, that he had no special privileges, that his single-parent status meant he struggled with ordinary difficulties. None of them paused to question why he was so self-contained, why he didn't flaunt wealth or influence, why he kept a certain distance from the social theatrics of the school community. They took his quietness as an invitation, as if it were an open door for mockery. They believed that because he didn't assert himself, because he didn't make waves, he was fair game for jokes, teasing, and public embarrassment. In reality, he was neither invisible nor ordinary. But that was invisible to them because they only saw what they wanted to see. A man who didn't fit their image of power, authority, or excitement. They ignored the subtle indicators of his intelligence, his confidence, and the understated charisma that comes from someone who has achieved far more than anyone around him could imagine. They had mistaken humility for weakness, calm for complacency, and privacy for vulnerability. They didn't understand that someone who moves quietly through the world is often the one who has the deepest awareness, the clearest priorities, and the sharpest strategic thinking. He had never made an issue out of being a single parent. There was no bitterness in his tone when talking about his son, no need to seek sympathy or admiration. He treated every interaction with grace, whether it was with teachers, staff, or students. He didn't need validation, and he didn't need to prove anything, because he had already built his life and his accomplishments in ways that were far beyond the imagination of a group of teenagers. And yet, the students saw his quietness as weakness, his discretion as dullness, and his modesty as a flaw. They could not comprehend that his life operated on a scale they had never experienced and never would. They even talked about him behind his back, creating mental caricatures based on the smallest fragments of information. A gesture he made, a word he said, the style of his jacket, they twisted all of it into evidence of the person they had already decided he was. They mocked the way he walked down the hall, how he interacted with teachers, how he smiled when greeting students. Every detail was exaggerated in their minds, and they shared it with each other in whispered laughter, not realizing that the very things they thought made him vulnerable were actually reflections of composure, self-respect, and intelligence. He went about his day as he always did, never showing that he knew the attention or misjudgment he was receiving. There was a confidence in how he carried himself, a quiet patience in how he dealt with interactions. He didn't overcompensate. He didn't need to defend himself. He didn't react to every small jab or whisper that might have been intended to provoke him. He understood the world differently. His priorities were set in ways that went far beyond hallway gossip, passing judgments, or fleeting teenage amusement. The students, focused on instant reactions and shallow observations, could not see the depth behind his calm exterior. Even when he smiled or offered a polite nod to someone, it was met with misinterpretation. Some assumed it was awkward or forced, others saw it as a lack of confidence. In truth, it was nothing more than a measured, deliberate acknowledgement of the world around him. He did not seek approval, and he did not seek attention. Every step he took, every word he spoke, reflected the life he had built on his own terms, a life that quietly radiated authority, experience, and achievement without the need for display. His very presence challenged assumptions, though no one realized it. The students were so convinced of their narrative that they could not imagine anyone like him living a life that exceeded their understanding. Their arrogance blinded them, and their laughter became a prelude to a reality they could not yet see. The part that made the situation so precarious wasn't just that the classmates had chosen him as a target. It was that they completely underestimated him. From the moment they noticed him, they had assumed they knew everything there was to know, as if they could read a person's life story from a few glimpses in the hallway. They didn't stop to consider that someone who moved quietly, who never drew attention, might actually be thinking 3 steps ahead, observing them just as closely as they were observing him. Their arrogance created a false sense of security, a belief that this would be an easy, harmless prank, that they could manipulate the scene like actors on a stage. Every laugh, every whisper, every glance they exchanged reinforced their conviction that they were clever, that they held all the power, and that their target was powerless. They imagined him as someone fragile, someone who would blush, stumble, or freeze when confronted. In their minds, the plan was foolproof. They had rehearsed scenarios, anticipated reactions, and even ranked the possible levels of embarrassment he might display. The more they talked, the more they filled in gaps with assumptions, building a story in which they were the dominant characters and he was the helpless victim. They ignored the subtle clues that could have warned them otherwise. The way he carried himself with quiet authority, the small, confident gestures that suggested composure, the measured tone of his voice that indicated he was fully aware of the world around him. They also underestimated his intellect. In their eyes, he was simply a single parent who kept to himself, someone whose life outside the school was irrelevant or ordinary. They assumed that without constant social engagement or flamboyant displays, he must lack sophistication or worldly experience. They didn't realize that someone who avoids the need for approval often has the sharpest awareness, that a life built from discipline, experience, and careful decisions rarely leaves room for foolishness or humiliation. Every time they whispered jokes or planned their moves, they were playing a game with someone who was fully capable of reading the room, analyzing motives, and anticipating consequences. Their underestimation went beyond intelligence. It extended to character. They assumed he was weak, that he lacked assertiveness, that he could be manipulated with a few well-placed words or gestures. They believed that because he had not reacted to casual encounters, because he had not boasted or displayed dominance in social situations, he must be timid or submissive. What they failed to see was that strength often hides behind subtlety. Confidence does not always shout. Sometimes it walks quietly through a room, commanding respect without demanding it. And experience, true experience, is not always visible in immediate reactions. They assumed immediacy equaled competence, that a delayed or calm response meant inability, when in reality patience and discretion are often hallmarks of the most capable individuals. The classmates also underestimated his resilience. In their rehearsed scenarios, they imagined that he would crumble under public scrutiny, that a few jokes or mocking comments would shake him. They didn't account for the fact that he had faced far greater challenges than anything a classroom prank could produce. Life had already tested him in ways they could not comprehend. Obstacles, setbacks, moments that required perseverance and self-control. Those experiences had honed his ability to remain composed, to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Every attempt they made to provoke a reaction only revealed the depth of their ignorance, because they assumed that a calm exterior was empty, not knowing it was fortified by years of navigating complexity with skill and patience. Their arrogance blinded them to his achievements. They thought that wealth, influence, or accomplishment were visible only through grand gestures, expensive clothing, or loud announcements. They failed to recognize that someone can build an empire quietly, deliberately, and with focus that requires neither display nor ego. To them, his silence was a sign of ordinariness, a canvas for their ridicule, when in fact it was the opposite, a reflection of someone who had mastered self-discipline, financial acumen, and personal integrity. They could not imagine that the man they were planning to mock was living a life that dwarfed their assumptions in ways they had never encountered. Even small interactions that they misinterpreted revealed their underestimation. When he smiled politely at someone, nodded in acknowledgement, or listened attentively without interrupting, they saw awkwardness, hesitance, or lack of confidence. They did not see careful observation, measured judgment, and social intelligence. They overlooked the way he read the room, gauged the mood, and processed information in ways that were invisible to them, but far more advanced than their own assumptions could capture. Because of this, every step of their plan was built on a foundation of error. They believed they had the upper hand, that they understood him completely, that they could predict his behavior. And the more confident they became, the further they strayed from reality, blind to the simple fact that they were dealing with someone whose life experience, intelligence, and composure had been underestimated at their own peril. The moment they decided to act, everything they had imagined collided with reality in ways they couldn't anticipate. The classmates moved forward with the kind of bravado that comes from assuming the world will always respond as they expect. They had rehearsed the jokes, timed their gestures, and positioned themselves with precision, confident that their plan would unfold exactly as they envisioned. Some of them exchanged quick grins and whispered reminders, feeding off each other's excitement, while others tried to hold back laughter, pretending to be casual bystanders as they circled closer to their target. Every detail mattered, or so they thought. When the interaction finally began, the tension in the air was palpable. They leaned in, speaking in tones meant to tease, to belittle, to provoke discomfort. They laughed at their own cleverness, assuming that the man they were targeting would mirror the reaction they had imagined: embarrassment, hesitation, maybe a nervous chuckle. The classroom, or the corner of the hallway they had chosen, became their stage, and in their minds, he was the main act, the perfect subject for mockery. They hadn't counted on subtlety or composure. They hadn't prepared for intelligence, awareness, or dignity. Almost immediately, the dynamic shifted in ways they hadn't expected. Instead of faltering, the man remained calm, his movements measured, his expression neutral but firm. There was no twitch, no stumble, no sign of uncertainty. Every word he spoke, even in response to their jabs, carried clarity, confidence, and subtle authority. The classmates had assumed that silence would mean weakness, that a quiet demeanor was a blank canvas for ridicule, but instead, it became a mirror reflecting their own overconfidence. Their jokes, meant to provoke laughter, felt smaller, less impactful. Every attempt at mockery seemed to be met with understanding rather than vulnerability. The situation grew more uncomfortable as his composure held steady. The students had imagined control, but now they were navigating an unpredictable reality. They glanced at each other, searching for reassurance, for validation, and finding none. The laughter that had bubbled in their throats began to fade, replaced by uncertainty. They realized, too late, that the man they had underestimated was fully aware of their intentions, and he was in no rush to react impulsively. He had the patience to let their arrogance expose itself, the intelligence to read their behavior, and the confidence to remain unshaken. Every mocking remark they made seemed to highlight their own immaturity rather than affect him. Their carefully rehearsed gestures, intended to provoke, became awkward as they realized they were performing for themselves more than for him. He didn't interrupt, he didn't escalate, he didn't retaliate, but that didn't mean he was powerless. His quiet strength became the counterweight to their clumsy arrogance, a force they had neither measured nor respected. Each of their actions, designed to dominate or humiliate, instead revealed the depth of their underestimation and the fragility of their assumptions. Some students tried subtle tactics to regain control, attempting sideways jokes or whispered comments meant to isolate him, thinking they could manipulate the situation by splitting attention or creating small distractions. But he remained present, aware of every nuance, every movement, and every tone. It was as if nothing escaped his notice, as if he had anticipated every angle. Their confidence faltered further with each passing moment, and the laughter they had expected never materialized. The plan that had seemed so foolproof now felt shaky, like a structure built on sand. Even the observers, those who had not actively participated, began to sense the shift. The energy in the room changed from excitement to tension. Whispers and stifled giggles faltered as the reality became clear. The man at the center of their attention was not reacting as they had predicted. Instead, he carried an aura of control, subtly commanding attention without needing to assert dominance. The students' arrogance, which had fueled their plotting, now worked against them, creating an awkward contrast between expectation and reality. The more the classmates pressed forward with their mockery, the more evident it became that their assumptions were flawed. They had underestimated not only his intelligence, but also his ability to read the situation, to maintain composure under pressure, and to subtly assert presence without drawing unnecessary attention. Each failed attempt at provocation chipped away at the confidence they had built up in their own minds, and slowly, the center of attention shifted. The lesson was unfolding in real time, though none of them yet realized it fully. Even small gestures that were meant to intimidate or embarrass revealed the flaw in their plan. A teasing glance, a sarcastic remark, a deliberately exaggerated laugh. Each was met with calm acknowledgement, a polite nod, or measured silence. The man's quiet resilience contrasted sharply with their impulsiveness, highlighting their underestimation and the gap between perceived and actual control. With every passing second, their strategy weakened, replaced by a growing sense of unease and self-awareness that they could not easily ignore. The turning point came when the truth began to surface, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, until it could no longer be ignored. The classmates had approached the situation with confidence, convinced that they knew everything about the man they were mocking. They believed that his quiet demeanor, his measured movements, and his modest appearance were all signs of ordinariness, of a life that lacked the kind of accomplishments they could even imagine. Every step they had taken in planning their mockery was based on that assumption. But reality has a way of revealing itself, especially when arrogance is met with experience, intelligence, and a life lived on a scale far beyond what anyone expects. It started with small hints. Some classmates noticed that his gestures were precise, deliberate, and calm, almost like a subtle signal that he understood more than he was letting on. Others caught glimpses of his watch, a simple yet unmistakably high-end timepiece, which contrasted sharply with the plain clothing they had fixated on. Every detail they had overlooked began to reveal inconsistencies in the narrative they had constructed in their minds. The man they had assumed was vulnerable, naive, or awkward was quietly demonstrating the hallmarks of someone who had mastered control over his surroundings and his life. As the day progressed, whispers began to spread. Someone in the classroom mentioned, almost casually, that he had been seen in meetings with people who clearly weren't ordinary, that he moved in circles far beyond the school's confines. The information was fragmented, passed along in half-formed stories, yet it planted seeds of doubt. The students, who had previously laughed at the idea of his sophistication, now found themselves questioning what they had assumed. The man they were attempting to humiliate had a life and achievements that were invisible to them, hidden beneath the surface, but unmistakably real once glimpsed. Then came the moment that changed everything. A piece of undeniable information, shared casually, almost as if it were irrelevant, that revealed his actual standing in the world. Someone mentioned that he wasn't just successful. He was extremely wealthy, the kind of wealth that commands influence, that allows for decisions and investments on a global scale. Suddenly, every gesture, every calm word, every measured glance made sense. His quiet demeanor, his refusal to flaunt wealth, his careful observation, all were consistent with someone who had already achieved far more than anyone in the room could imagine. They realized that the man they had underestimated wasn't just a single dad quietly raising a child. He was worth over $100 million. The reaction among the classmates was immediate and visceral. Laughter turned to disbelief. Smirks vanished, replaced by stares of shock. The arrogance that had fueled their plan dissolved into awkwardness, confusion, and a dawning realization that they had misjudged the person entirely. The man they had thought would be the punchline was, in fact, someone whose accomplishments dwarfed their own assumptions. Their mockery, once thought to be harmless and clever, now felt foolish, misplaced, and almost embarrassing. What struck them most wasn't just the wealth itself, but the way he carried it, or, more accurately, the way he didn't carry it. He hadn't boasted, he hadn't flaunted, he hadn't drawn attention to himself in any way that would suggest the scale of his success. His presence alone had been understated, almost ordinary, but the reality was extraordinary. Their perception, built on surface-level judgments and adolescent assumptions, had failed completely. They had equated quietness with weakness, simplicity with mediocrity, and humility with inferiority, and the truth shattered every one of those assumptions. Even small interactions began to take on new meaning. The nods he had given, the calm acknowledgement of their jokes, the way he had listened without interruption, all of it revealed strategic awareness, patience, and composure that aligned perfectly with someone who had built an empire. They began to understand that his silence and discretion were not signs of vulnerability, but of power and experience. Everything they had underestimated, his confidence, his intelligence, his ability to read people, was now unmistakably apparent. As the news spread further, the classmates could feel the shift in the room's energy. Their whispers, once filled with amusement, became hushed murmurs of astonishment. Some tried to rationalize it, to insist that wealth didn't matter, that his calmness was irrelevant, but deep down, they knew their initial assumptions had been completely wrong. Every detail they had ignored, every misjudgment they had made, suddenly took on significance. They had underestimated him, and that underestimation had blinded them to the reality of his life, his achievements, and his true stature in the world. In that moment, the power dynamic reversed completely. The man who had been quiet, who had not reacted, who had allowed them to play out their plan, now emerged as the undeniable center of attention, not through anger, confrontation, or overt displays, but through a revelation that they could not ignore. Their arrogance, their assumptions, and their laughter were exposed for what they truly were, a product of misunderstanding, ignorance, and underestimation of someone whose worth was far beyond what they could perceive. The lesson that emerged from that day was quiet but undeniable, and it began to sink into everyone who had witnessed it, especially the classmates who had once been so eager to mock. For all their planning, their whispered jokes, and their imagined superiority, they had overlooked a fundamental truth. Appearances are deceiving, and pride can blind you to reality. They had thought they understood the world, that they could read people at a glance, that a quiet, understated person must naturally be weaker, less accomplished, or less significant than someone flashy or loud. But the day had proven them wrong, in a way that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about wealth or success. That was only the most obvious manifestation of the lesson. The deeper understanding came from observing how the man carried himself, how he had handled every interaction with composure, patience, and awareness. They had assumed that to assert power, you had to dominate a conversation, to boast, to draw attention. But they had seen firsthand that true strength doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to announce itself with grand gestures or flashy displays. Sometimes, it is quiet, controlled, and entirely self-contained, revealed only in the moment when others attempt to challenge it. The classmates began to feel the weight of their misjudgment. Every joke they had whispered in confidence, every sly glance or mocking smile, now carried a new meaning. They realized how shallow their observations had been, how small their understanding of human character truly was. They had believed that their assumptions were sufficient, that surface impressions could substitute for real knowledge, and that arrogance was a tool they could wield without consequence. The lesson, stark and immediate, was that underestimating someone is always risky, because there are depths to people that are invisible until they choose to reveal them, or until circumstances make it unavoidable. Even more humbling was the realization that the man they had attempted to humiliate had allowed them to act, had given them room to believe they were in control. He hadn't reacted impulsively or defensively. He hadn't made a scene or lashed out. Instead, he had observed, calculated, and, when the moment came, revealed his reality in a way that left them speechless. Their arrogance had been met not with anger, but with quiet authority. That contrast, the way he had handled himself versus the way they had behaved, was the most powerful part of the lesson. They had been so focused on mocking and asserting dominance that they failed to recognize the presence of someone who was quietly in command of the situation. It also became clear that assumptions about family, background, and lifestyle can be dangerously misleading. They had believed that a single dad who appeared modest, who kept to himself, and who didn't broadcast his life must live an ordinary, limited existence. They had assumed that being a single parent somehow meant he was vulnerable, that being quiet or polite was equivalent to weakness, and that the absence of visible status symbols reflected a lack of achievement. Each of these assumptions had been proven false, and each misjudgment had contributed to the unfolding lesson. Their confidence, built on false premises, had crumbled under the weight of reality, leaving them with nothing but the stark acknowledgement of their error. There was also the human element that could not be ignored. The classmates realized that their actions had consequences beyond mere embarrassment or amusement. Mocking someone based on incomplete knowledge or shallow perception was not just reckless, it was cruel. They had ignored dignity, empathy, and respect, and the lesson was reinforced not by punishment, but by the undeniable contrast between their behavior and the man's response. They had expected to humiliate, but in reality, they had been humbled. The situation forced them to confront not just their assumptions about wealth or success, but their assumptions about people, about judgment, and about the consequences of acting arrogantly. The lesson extended beyond just this one classroom or one interaction. It spoke to a universal truth about human behavior, that people are complex, that their worth cannot always be measured by appearances, and that confidence, humility, and patience often hide incredible depth. Those who rush to mock, to judge, or to assert superiority may find themselves blindsided by realities they had failed to perceive. In the moments when they least expect it, the quiet, unassuming, and underestimated can reveal power, achievement, and insight far beyond the comprehension of those who have judged them. Every detail of the day reinforced the same point. The calm gestures, measured words, polite nods, and composed silence all contrasted sharply with the frantic energy, whispered jokes, and misplaced confidence of the students. It became evident that underestimation is not merely an error in judgment. It is a vulnerability. Arrogance may provide temporary confidence, but it leaves one blind to the strengths, experiences, and hidden capabilities of others. And slowly, as the day went on, the weight of that realization settled in. It was no longer just a matter of embarrassment for the classmates. It was a lesson in humility, perspective, and the importance of seeing beyond surface impressions. Every mocking glance and every whispered joke became a reminder of how easily arrogance can mislead, how easily assumptions can fail, and how important it is to respect people for more than the image they present.